just start recording, but just to say this. Also, I think that I'll be a bit smarter this time, and I'll just use the actual overly open file so we can actually add the comments straight to the document here. We don't need to add comments, then translate it to our document and add it to the text and things like this. I think it's easier.
Yeah, that's a really good idea, actually.
Yeah, I don't know why I didn't think of this before. So just to recapitulate what we saw this far, right? I mean, I sent you guys a new version of the text, and this is what we're working on right now. If you look at this, you'll see that we recently decided after a couple of meetings to go all the way to the end of volume 1, because there wasn't that much missing anyway. So the text that we proposed, and if you read the introduction or the conclusion, it suggests that the text ends here, which is around chapter 23 or something. But since then, because we are basically going crazy and becoming obsessed with this, we added these 2 other sections, which are pretty much done, and we're working on this one now, which has this very simple title of The Greater Logic of Capitalist Accumulation, but which in Capital also has a epic title of The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. So it's pretty much right there at the end of the book. After this, we probably only need 1 section because we already covered something about what Marx calls primitive accumulation on the section on the multi-layered transcendental. So just so I don't think we need to cover these new sections because it's kind of like a addition that's coming late to the game, right? It's not something we plan to do, so I think it's okay if we don't cover it, even though this is where, especially these 2 parts here, I think it's where issues of scale are the clearest. There's a big jump in the perspective of capital once Marx finishes presenting simple reproduction. And I think that it's very interesting to look at it because of that. So I don't know, it might be good to jump ahead at some point and discuss a bit of that, just because I think it's a really interesting test to this conceptual language we're trying to employ with category theory, that it seems so neatly to translate to some other scale of analysis. So I don't know, it's just something to consider. But going back to the part that we said we would cover, right? In our first meeting, we pretty much dealt with these sections here. So we spoke of the basic premises of this approach, right? This idea that there is a third position, which is neither sort of fetishistic outlook on capital or the sort of attempt to clarify how it really is for us behind appearances. But the third option is to say how it really is for itself, right? What we call this objective phenomenology, which we stated that requires, like it requires us to always start from the question, what differences make a difference to a commodity, not for us, right? And this has a lot of consequences. The first consequence is that sometimes there is a shorter path to a concept. For example, labor is obviously different from other commodities. But the question is, what is the difference that labor makes that makes a difference for the commodity world, not for us? That labor is different for us, that's established. But is labor really different in the commodity world? Does it really behave itself differently? And so if you look at capital, this section, this and this, probably, like all of this kind of is developed in between chapter 1 and chapter 4, all the way to the formula of capital. And labor is already employed all the way here to talk about abstract labor, concrete labor, social necessary time, things like this. They're introduced right off the bat in the first chapter. And in our case, it only appears here. We started talking about it last time. This has a precedence in Marx, because Marx introduces labor in chapter 1, then he forgets about it, and then after he introduces capital, he introduces labor once more in a different way. And we interpret this as saying that he introduces it at first because the first chapter is that crazy thing, but conceptually labor only appears after capital. So labor doesn't even make a difference to commodities. Labor makes a difference to capital. Capital is, let's say, the sensible organ that is appropriate to sense that there is a difference to labor. Whereas money alone, money as simple consumption money, doesn't feel the difference. So if I take my money to the market and I buy some coffee, or I buy some hours of labor of a barista in the coffee shop, it's the same sort of operation. It's only as a capitalist holding money capital, holding money as something that is promising to make more money, as a sort of dynamical money. So it's from the perspective of that I that suddenly you can see a difference, a new difference between buying coffee and buying the barista's work. So we introduce labor into the picture in a slightly different way, right? But anyway, so this first step is a bit different from Marx because of that. And also another thing that happens is that once you're not talking about forms of value constrained by the more, let's say, philosophical or even political fact that labor is behind it all, because that's how we know it, that's how we see it. Once that's not the case, the form of value theory seems like a broader theory than we thought. It becomes a sort of general strategy for creating something like that I just mentioned. So the form of value, the logic of value, and the creation of a money commodity, you can interpret it as a process that can happen in many different ways, and that creates something like a metric which will make certain differences relevant, right? So in some sense, this is at the core of what we're trying to do, because we're using Badiou's atomic logic as a sort of general frame. Inside this atomic logic, there is the form of value as a sort of logic that you can apply to very different situations. It can be reapplied to itself. So we actually derive capital from money in the same logic that we derive money from commodities. And we derive labor time from labor in the same way that we derive money from commodities. So it's always the same way of creating a new metric based on previous metrics. Put it like this: metric's not the right term, but right, a different, let's say, a more sophisticated way of sensing difference, right? So this becomes a broader thing, and for example, the money commodity becomes a specific way of applying this. Social necessary labor time becomes a different way of applying this. So we gain because we have a broader theory of social, we can call a theory of social intelligibility, right? It's a theory that's trying to answer under which conditions will some form of social practice or some more social organization be able to sense new differences. And money is just one of those. Money capital is a different one of those. Social necessary labor time is a different one of those. And they're all kind of building on top of each other. So we gain the space to ask about, are there others? We make the form of value a sort of broader logic, right? It's a logic that we can encounter it again many times. And one of the first things we're going to discuss today is precisely a weird application of it, which we think it's not found anywhere. It's like our crazy suggestion. And it also helps to clarify what's going on in other places in the book. And I was talking to Raquel the other day about the fact that every time Marx wants to talk about this, about the construction of a new form of intelligibility in the capitalist space, he talks about averages. So yeah, well, there are many ways of doing this, or many organic compositions of capital, like ways of mixing together means of production and labor. There are many of those, but then there is the average way for that sector. And this average becomes a sort of metric for the composition in that sector. Or, oh, there are many kind of profits structures, but then you have the average profit rate. And that becomes a sort of metric that competition needs to work around and deal with. Or you have many ways of using labor, but then you have the average labor time to do something. And that becomes a metric inside the production process to how much or how labor is used. So average is like Marx's way to say we can abstract from individual standpoints and get an abstract standpoint that sees them all. And he even talks about, I mean, there are classical interpretations of what value means precisely as this, average equilibrium price. Like the mean price for a commodity is its value, something like this. So again, there are interpretations of value itself as an average. And in a way, Marx himself, when he's describing the value form, he also goes into that place. But average might be a technical concept in, I don't know, thermodynamics, when you're talking about statistical mechanics, renormalization groups, or whatever you want to discuss. But it's very muddy when you're talking about political economy, political organization. What does it mean to talk about, for example, the average militant, to describe how much you should be doing or something like this? It can be very mystifying. So I think that one of the operations we're doing is substituting all Marx's discussion of average for a more logical discussion of predicates, meaning an average can be thought of a predicate that can, more important than quantity, because average has that idea of quantity, right? Is a sort of quality that is common to all. An average, in our sense, is a kind of a qualitative, is substituted for a more qualitative treatment, which kind of precedes the quantitative comparison. So we'll get a bit into that, but I think that, I mean, we haven't even discussed this very far, Dennis and I. I'm just throwing it out there because I think it's an interesting point. Which is interesting also because category theory and applied category theory has a lot to offer, and a lot is being done in fields where open dynamical systems are at play, and this idea of establishing a sort of equilibrium between different systems is very important. And applied category theory doesn't really seem to approach it from the standpoint, I mean, it informs a slightly different view of these things than from the standpoint of establishing the equilibrium by itself. It adds a logical layer to all of this, and which I think we're exploiting that as well.
Gabriel, just one thing. When you talk about predicates, do you think that you're relating to a whole, like the average is relating to a whole too, or not? Yeah,
I mean, that's something I'm still trying to understand. I think that we will see an example of this with the way we derive social necessary labor time and how it is connected to how Marx derives money. But for example, in the case of money is not necessarily it's true that money sees the totality. Right? You can exchange money for any other commodity. But money is not, let's say, derived from the totality quantitatively. Money is qualitatively connected to the totality before anything else, right? I mean, that's the difference between money commodity and other commodities. It's the singularity of money, that if I have money, I can exchange it for any other commodity. But if I have any other commodity, I need to find someone specific that wants it. So I cannot exchange it for any other. That's a qualitative distinction, not a quantitative one. It expresses itself in many quantitative issues, like you see specific quantities of commodities. But it has that first step, which is connecting qualitatively to the whole. And one of the things we're using a lot is this idea of universal exposition, which is a concept that Badiou pretty much invented, but using this formalism to describe, to kind of benefit from the fact that if you have something like this, you can interpret this metaphorically as saying X sees Y. It doesn't mean, for example, that everything in X is relevant to Y. There might be things here that are not being seen. Whereas, for example, if you write something like this, you could interpret it as the things in X that are relevant to Y, right? In the sense that something of it's Y that is going into X. And I'm simplifying radically here, right? But anyway, the universal exposition is the fact that you can have many elements here, and you can have some special element that is capable of, no matter what you change here, there is a version of it, so either this version or some other version, that will see these things. And so one way of interpreting this is saying, like, if you have a commodity and you have a different commodity and they are of the same value, so you can exchange them, there is some quantity of money that can be exchanged for this and for this. If I change this to a different one and this to a different one of different value, there is another quantity of money that still sees this and still sees this. So this quality, this property is a qualitative one. It's not a quantitative one at first. It's very special that it appears as a quantity in the case of money, but that's not necessarily so. We try to derive it even. That's one of the crazy things we spoke of very quickly, but in our theory, what is very weird is that quantity is a predicate. It's not like it's first a predicate, and then you can quantify like 10, 20, 30. So we try to show that there is a qualitative dimension to this process. I think with the example, it will become a bit clearer. But this is nice for us, because if you're interested in asking the question, in which ways can we see the world, the complex social world, you might not want to only have quantitative measures, right? So for example, just to play with something I know Raquel is also studying, imagine you have a myth 1 here, and you have it translates somewhere else to a myth 2 that is different, right? But we know one is a variation of the other. There can be something which we could call like the basic structure of the myth, some structure here, that can be seen to be, let's say, the base that sees both this and this. So for example, just to be very simple, in myth 1, you have something like a very epic, complicated story with many characters doing a lot of things, and so on and so forth. In the transformed myth 2, it's very simple, with very few characters, only one action. If the structure is something like X does something to Y, right? There is some transfer, this basic structure appears in both cases, right? And if I find you a different myth, there might be a slightly different version, a slightly more expanded one where X and Y do something to Z or whatever, that still sees those transformations as part of the same myth structure or something like this. I'm just giving these examples because these are not quantitative. These are qualitative, right? They're narrative structures. They're not prices, but they can fit the same structure. So this material, this logic we're using, it can treat qualitative things as metrics of some weird idea of metric, right? For a space. For example, musical variations under a theme. You can have many variations, and the theme, which is a musical thing, is not a quantifiable thing. Like, it's just a set of relations. That set of relations is still, there are specific transformations that take it to every variation. Right? So you could talk about that theme allowing you to see something in sound, or hear something in the case. Right? I'm going total crazy here. Dennis, please interrupt me, but I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I mean, it's all correct, but it's, yeah, the thing is, it needs to be, you know, it takes time for this to sink in a bit, because a lot is packed into this diagrammatic notation of category theory. But just as an example, the musical example, if we take as objects in our category a musical object and our ears, so something like this, right? Then this arrow actually contains every possible way that this music appears to our ears, right? A single arrow in our diagram isn't just one way of hearing this music, but all possible ways.
Yeah.
And we use this term in I think in the introduction, called the method of logical restriction.
It's in the conclusion.
Yeah, in the conclusion. And I interpret this as being a way to filter this arrow into a specific set of arrows.
Yeah, in that case, I would use the theme and variation example better than the music and the ears, because the ears is very subjective. And if you take the theme and variations, you can see that there are constraints that are, I mean, if you deform the theme in some ways is acceptable, but some other ways are not, right?
Yeah. I mean, it works either way, because I mean, even forgetting the way of subjectively understanding music, I mean, I just mean simply the sound waves themselves. Let's say the sound waves of music hitting the ears. We can think like of the physical response to the sound waves as being consisting of a lot of different levels, right? There's a lot of frequencies, and there's a lot of there's volume and so on. There's different aspects of the information that pass from the source to the target. And the method of logical restriction is just how we want to filter that information to only a certain subset of ways of listening, ways of hearing this music.
Yeah, I think I would unpack this in a somewhat intuitive way as encoding a difference between seeing and seeing as. I'm always getting back to this, but it is striking that this does exactly that. Like you have an arrow, the arrow is unspecified to what is being seen between A and B, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then the third one is defining what is the mediator between them both, in a sense.
Yes.
So you are what in that lower arrow is being seen by B. So it's a kind of seeing as, like you can see something in potentially infinite different ways, and the third term there is kind of picking out from all these possible ways, one way that is being seen, right? Something like this. You can also unpack this as a criterion of something, like a criterion of understanding of something.
Exactly.
Thing, something like that.
Also, yeah, that's what this third object is. The third object that sees both is it's the manifestation of the filtering criteria. What we use to filter it. That's the third object.
But I have a question. If I remember correctly, of course, this is independent from Badiou, it's formalism from category theory. But in the chapter of relations from logics of roles, it seems that it's an obligatory thing. You have to have the third one. Every relation has to be exposed, right? So this is kind of this is interesting because, in a sense, if we understand it the way we are talking now, it seems to say that every relation is a certain type of relation, and the third term is always defining the type of relation that is going on between two terms, something like that.
Yeah.
Out of an unspecified potential infinity of different relations that could obtain between A and B, or something like this. So it seems that this makes also also intuitive the obligatory, the mandatory character of the third term. If I'm correct, I don't remember exactly.
I think that his point is that
it has to be exposed, right?
Yeah, but I think that the important thing, I mean, what Dennis said is very important, and I think that this is the reason why I want to spend a bit of time with this part, is because I think it clarifies what we mean by objective phenomenology. Because this thing Dennis said is very important, right? If I have this, if this is all the ways that something is for something else, right? That A goes to B. It's too vague, right? And you can add something that the moment that one relation needs to be coherent with other relations, it cannot be anything. It needs to be something rather than something else. So the more you're able to add these arrows, the more you're restricting them to be something rather than something else, right? That's the first part. But the second part is that this structure here is a secondary structure. For example, we introduced this in our proposition 9. We don't talk about this sort of structure before going through 7 or 8 different steps. Why? Because these third things here, they're also not objects out there. So they're themselves constructed in a way that needs to be homogeneous with these arrows to begin with.
Yeah.
So ultimately what you have is like relations and relation here and relation here between objects which are what we can call composites. And composition is a relation.
Mm-hmm.
And this as well, composites and composites. So it's relations of relations. So we don't start by saying there is something out there called X, and X relates to this other thing out there called Y. You need to first, in an equally relational way, define what you call X, what you call Y, which still is very vague, and then you restrict it with this arrow, right? So this is relevant to what we're saying, because if you take a look at the steps that we take here, it will take a very long time to arrive at, so between this point and this point, to define what it means to construct an object that is a commodity, what sort of arrows can come out of it, right? So that the idea that if you have a commodity and there are operations that will take you to a different commodity. So why are they different to begin with? That's actually has to do with how they're composed. That's the whole use set, exchange set thing, right? Once we do that, we show that there are ways of, let's say, seeing things from only fixing one and only looking at other stuff from its position, right? So this is the first way to restrict the meaning of these arrows. It's the arrows such that they're all seen from the same commodity, right? That's, for us, a way of understanding what Marx calls the expanded relative form. It's like you have some commodity, you leave it fixed, and then you consider its relation to every other commodity. Y of C, Z of B, and so on and so forth. What did you do? You fixated one, and now you get more information out of these arrows, right? But you can also do something else, which is, I want to find another predicate here that not only sees all of this, but also sees this. Right? And this would be how we define the money form.
Yeah, that's
The thing that I wanted to highlight is that we understand this to be interpretable as a predicate, just to go back to what Raquel asked. Because when you see everything in terms of one thing, it's like asking how much like C is D, how much like C is B, how much like C is C prime. So it's like you created a predicate C-ness. Right? So for us, this statement that X of A equals Y of B in Marx is more like saying, which he already says this, that it's the value of X of A is the use value of Y of B, right? So the Y of B is, let's say, embodying the value of X of Y. So you can understand that as to say that you're looking at Y of B in terms of how much like C it is. How much is the value of C expressed in it? So that's a predicate logic. That's not a mathematical equivalence. So when Marx writes something like X equal Y, he's not really writing it the same way that you would write 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah.
He's more writing it like you would say subject is predicate. Value is, and then you put a commodity here. So this is why we're interpreting that this part is hidden behind this. So you can have the value form without quantity. You can have the value form for a predicate logic before you get to quantity. So
this is also very striking how this is close to Hegel's chapter on measures, like pretty much the same thing, right? Like every measure is a relationship between measures. And you don't know, it's not fixated in advance what is the unity being measured. You just have one thing, another thing, and then you look for something that is homogeneous between the things that is able to measure something among them, one for the other, something like this.
Mm-hmm.
And then you extract from the comparison itself some kind of unit or some kind of third measure that will make the mediation. It's pretty much the same.
Yeah, it's very similar. But the importance for us is that then you can have the same logic, right? Where you can find a predicate that looks at every other predicate in a way that you can assess from each perspective how much like it is. So how much M-ness there is in C, how much M-ness there is in D, how much M-ness there is in F or whatever. Well, how much M-ness there is, if this is the money commodity, this is how much like money is this? Well, how much like money, that's almost the price. If the much like becomes a quantity, right? If I, instead of saying it's very much like money, it's not much like money, I start talking about it's like money in the exact measure of 10. It's like money in the exact measure of 2. Suddenly it became a quantitative logic.
Yeah.
So we wanted to make that step explicit because there is something in money that allows this to happen. Not all commodities have this. So for example, this is what is called a homomeric property, right? Homomerism is the case where you have an object, it has some quality, and for example, if you take half of that object, it has the same quality. So gold, if you take a bar of gold and you split it in half, it remains gold. If you split it in half again, it remains gold. So it's objects that qualitative change can become only quantitative ones, right? I turned something into 2 things, but those 2 things are still the same quality. So if you look at all commodities that were money commodities in history, the tendency is that most of them were homomeric. The tendency is that, as we play here, a piano is not a good money commodity because half of a piano is not a piano. You can only bundle more pianos together, but half of a piano is not a piano. So it's very kind of, it's only homomeric by aggregation, right? Whereas, for example, salt half of a pile of salt is a smaller pile of salt. Half of the half is still a pile of salt. And salt was a very common money commodity. Gold, water, oil, all sort of things, spices, these things that you can restrict them, partition them, but they remain of the same quality. So you see, there must be some specific relation of money commodity to itself, a material relation, right? There is a material property that allows this to be treated as quantitative changes, because money, and now half of money is still money. So I can still ask of things and get, for example, rather than, let me put it like this, rather than the same amount, I will get, for example, half of it. You correlate with half of this. So you need to find this to be able to totally order value, so that all your judgments about the value of things, these predications, they become orderable. And once they become totally orderable, such that if I say two different things, that C is valued M and D is valued M line, either M is higher than M line or M line is higher than M, right? That this becomes the case. That's an added property. That's not ontologically guaranteed, and that's not necessary for you to have a measure. You can have qualitative ways of making things intelligible, like we were talking about with Lévi-Strauss. The transformations of a myth structure to another, or the finding of a basic myth contradiction or something like this, some sort of basic difference, doesn't need to be translatable into a quantity. Only in certain cases will that be true, right? So that I'm insisting on this point because I think it's relevant for other possible projects we can take out of this, and it also explains why we took so much trouble into these first steps, right? So, and then after we did all of this, we started last time and we saw, I think, these 3 points. We discussed our current approach to how to describe a world that has many layers. Since then, we talked a bit more about this, and we have other ideas on how to make this better, because there might be a better way to show the difference between having many worlds and having one world with many transcendentals. Like, there might be a better way of doing that, but we'll leave it aside for now. Then we presented the 3 forms of capital: interest, merchant, and industrial capital. And we used these layers to help us distinguish them, right? We show that, and I think that at this point, if we go there, it should make a bit more sense, right? So we introduced this idea of universal properties, right? Something that sees other relations, how this works, and so on. And then we introduce capital, which is written here, as something that sees money becoming more money, right? So if you have different quantities of money, capital can see this. There is a change to capital that accommodates a change to money. Let's put it like this. And then we started talking about.
I have a comment here. Also, I think we already mentioned this, but just to make it explicit again, that this K phi can itself be a quantity of money in actuality, right? So it's like money has 2 existences, one as medium for exchange, but also logically as this K phi object, right? Which, that aligns with what Marx says when he says that money is always already potentially capital, right? Yeah. So the same commodity, the same object, is actually 2 different objects in our category, depending on its place in the relation.
One way I think you can understand that is the following. Like, imagine you have like a building block, okay? And you have, so it's some material here, and you have some other material here, A and B. If I have a ruler, there is some way of assigning some size in our ruler to A and to B, so that we can say, for example, that A and B are of the same size, right? That's the same thing with saying that there is some amount of money that sees that this commodity 1 and this commodity 2, which are exchangeable, are of the same value. Now imagine that I don't have a ruler that is made of wood, but elastic, meaning that if I give you a number, a point in the ruler, I can expand the ruler a bit, and this point will vary, right? So if I measure something, I can kind of make the ruler larger, and the point that measured 10 will now kind of stretch, and it will move a bit, right? Imagine measuring things with that ruler. You could see something and not only measure its size, but measure the size that it could be if you stretch it, right? So for that ruler, for our rubber band ruler that can be stretched a bit, for example, if I see some size A and I see a size B, I might be able to say, no, these two can be seen in the same way, right? This is, for example, the beginning before I stretch, and this other is after I stretched. So I think it's nice to think of capital like that. Imagine it's dynamic money. It's not money that is looking at what value things have, but it's also looking at how much value they can transfer. So it will look at if things can become more valuable than they are, if you stretch them a bit, right?
Exactly, yeah. And the stretchiness is also the corresponding arrow here. So again, we have this kind of dialectical relationship between the three vertices of our triangle, right? Like the object at the top, and then there's two objects here. We said at the beginning that if you take just these arrows between X and Y, it can be any way that X sees Y. But then depending on what we choose for this third object, we are filtering this arrow for specific properties. So in this case, we're filtering the relations between our MS and MT here. We're filtering them for specifically the stretchy property that Gabriel is talking about, this potential or dynamic function.
And again, it goes back to what Caron was talking about in terms of seeing as. It literally is that.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
if I'm a consumer, meaning I work under the simple circulation strategy, right? I have a commodity, I exchange it for money, then I exchange it for a different commodity. When I have money in my hand, meaning there is no dynamic use, it's just an equivalent. If I have other commodities here, I only see them as equivalents or not equivalents, right? That's how this constrains my view. Like I get somewhere and I look, okay, of everything in the shopping mall, what can you buy and what can't you buy? That's what you're gonna see, right? And then you decide based on use, because that's the difference, right? Whereas in the capitalist circulation, so you have money, you will exchange it for commodities to make more money. When you are in the position of money, you're not looking at commodities D, C, and F based only on the equivalence. You're looking at them based on how much they can be stretched to acquire this value. So it's like I go into the shopping mall and I'm not interested in the equivalence to my money. Of course, that still holds because of this, which is the same as this, right? That still holds, but I'm seeing things as something else. I'm seeing them in their potential to become more than the value that they have. And because of that, it's because you see constrained in that way that you see the difference between means of production and labor. That's the first difference. Because if I have means of production, I have some commodity that at most can transfer its own value to the product, the same amount of money. And if I buy labor power, it can transfer more money, more value than its value. So this makes a difference because I'm looking at commodities from the standpoint of this constraint. So you see, we invented or we showed a new perspective on the world based on the internal differences that commodity makes to commodities. It's not a subject, I mean, no subject invents that you can look at things in this way. Commodities create that place, and then you can occupy that place and look at things like what Marx calls Mr. Moneybags, right? The capitalist, which is, again, he calls it the personification of capitalist categories, right? Personification of capitalist categories for us means to behave as if constrained by the logic of money, the logic of capital, so on and so forth. To see things as that makes you see, right? So we went through different forms of capital. I think that we presented something that is not very common, which is to show that interest capital, so money that becomes more money without any commodities being bought, so just money becoming more money, we suggest that the logic behind this is very strange, and the logic is actually that money as a commodity, right? We use those three transcendentals, right? We call TC when the object exists as commodity. We call TB when the object exists as a property, as a contract, in that the state is the object that sees it. And we call it TA when something exists as a gift in a reciprocal logic. So we define, our suggestion is that interest capital takes money that exists as commodity, turns it into money that exists as a gift, and because gifts require higher counter gifts, right? The counter gift needs to be bigger than the gift. The return for giving somebody money as a gift is more money. And then you index this on a contract and on the commodity form, and you're owed more money than you gave. So interest capital in its pure form would require the existence of reciprocal relations, of gift communities and things like this, which is David Graeber's argument when he talks about debt and credit, that anthropologically, there is a mixture between capital and the community form that allows you to exploit relations of debt and credit that are not invented by capital itself, right? To make money become more money. So we define, weirdly, I know it's very counterintuitive, but we define interest capital, the logic of it, right? Not in the case of financial capital or more complex capitalist forms of interest capital, but in this simpler form, without productive capital being involved, because once productive capital is introduced, you don't need this to work. But we call it, we define it in these terms, and we define merchant capital in the inverse terms. So rather than taking money and making it into an object that requires reciprocity, you take money, you buy a commodity, and you take that commodity away from a community. So away from the value system of its that determines how much people want it, somewhere else where it can be exchanged for more money, and then you reindex it. You bring it that more money to you. So in the case of interest capital, you go to other layers, to other logics, to benefit from the interior of that logic. And in merchant capital, you go to other logics to benefit from the exterior of that other logic, to benefit from going away from a community, right? It's nice because it connects interest and merchant capital, which I think it's not always clear. And it's also nice because it shows why industrial capital is special for Marx, because industrial capital is the first capital that happens entirely inside the commodity logic. It doesn't require other logics to work. That's why we say it's industrial capital constructs a path through compositional transformation. What does this mean? It's simply that you're going to spend some money to buy some commodities. You're going to change these commodities in some crazy way. You're going to mix them around, combine them, decompose them, whatever, to create a product. And this product will really be valued more than what you had before. So all of this happens inside the capitalist layer. It doesn't happen because of reciprocity, because of contracts. It happens inside the commodity layer. And rather than going outside, it goes into a decomposition of commodities rather than removal of from the commodity world, right? Last time, after presenting this, we showed that, well, the whole question becomes then this question here. Is it possible? Is there something which, if I have money and I buy commodities, that the combination of those commodities will give me a product that is worth more than the commodity that I have? So is this true? Is it possible to just combine commodities and the way they transfer their value to the product increases the value of the product? So only after we added that question, which is the question that Marx has at the end of the chapter on the formula of capital, the contradictions of the formula of capital. He dismisses all the explanations of surplus based on being smart and finding a better deal than the others and things like this. After he dismisses these solutions, he says, well, the only other solution is for there to be a commodity that is different than other commodities. But our position is the question, difference for what? Or from what standpoint? And now we have an answer, different from the standpoint of capital, different from the standpoint of the rubber ruler, right? If you don't have a rubber ruler, if you only have a normal ruler, you can't measure growth. You can't measure surplus extension of the height of something. You can either measure it's equal or it's unequal. If you can track a change, right? If you have a sort of differential ruler, then you can also track differences. So that information only becomes relevant once you have the ruler. You need to, this is like the basic principle. You can only make a difference, be relevant, if you construct the object which can see that difference, right? In our case, we construct capital and we construct labor as a special commodity together. So that's how we introduce the next point, which is the sort of point of view of production from the standpoint of capital, not from the standpoint of anthropology, of labor, of sociology, of workers, or whatever. It's a standpoint of a ruler that is concerned with, I want to combine things in such a way that the value transferred to the product is larger than the value of the things that I consumed in that process, right? So we introduce several distinctions using this, because once you have that idea of, commodity, those arrows that produce different commodities, right? That lead to different commodities, or the idea that you can combine multiple commodities into one and things like this, you can start asking questions about how does this help you differentiate commodities, right? So taking this idea, this basic structure, imagining this, right? You have two commodities and they were used to produce a commodity. And this commodity was combined with some other one to produce a third one, right? So if you take a look at this specific commodity here, it has arrows coming in and arrows coming out, right? Not this one. So just knowing this, you can ask questions. You can look at commodities and see if they fit, don't fit, if they're like this, they're not like this. So we start distinguishing commodities in this way. So if you first look at this part, you can ask, Are all commodities the product of other commodities? And no, that's not true. Commodities that are the product, right? So here's our commodity, and two other commodities went into making it. If that's the case, we call it a product. If no, there were no previous commodities. It wasn't product of commodity production. It was forced into commodity form. For example, land is like this. Land is not born as a commodity, right? It's the product of God knows which cosmological crazy process, but you can use the state to create a border and call it a property. So we call fictive commodities those commodities which become a commodity because they are indexed on A and B, on community as territory and on state as property before they become a commodity, right? So we can imagine this as saying something like, here's the commodity space. Some commodities were outside of it and they were here. Some other commodities were here. There were previous ones before it and they were produced inside. This we would call a product, and this we would call fictive commodity, right? Then we look at the other side, the arrows coming out, right? So for example, forgetting the arrows that came in, only looking at what comes out of the commodity. It's possible that it is combined with others to produce a new product. So it's part of the production. If that's the case, so if our commodity here is part of a composition with others to produce a product, we call it productive consumable. It's consumed in production. But that's not necessary, right? It can be consumed on its own with no composition that makes a commodity. That's what we write like this, right? So for example, if a commodity is here, it can be used to produce another commodity, or it can be, for example, removed from the world of commodities by consumption. It has no more information inside of it. Or it can be excluded from the layer. It still has its use, exists as use, it's just not exchanged anymore. No longer, you cannot touch it. For example, an item that you have a lot of affection for, you would never sell it, you don't use it for anything, you just keep it there. Like Louisa, a friend of Louisa's gave her a bottle of soda like 10 years ago. She never opened it. She has it in our shelf. It's just like old soda. You know, it's not being used, but it wasn't consumed as well. It's just stored because it's being considered from a different logic than the commodity logic, right? So we can be removed in this other way as well. So with this, we differentiate commodities only by looking at the arrows that went inside, that went into it, or the arrows that went out of it, right? And finally, looking only at the productive consumable, so commodities that go into production. So first, restricting to this, the case where you have a commodity that there are arrows going into it. I mean, in fact, we're not necessarily looking at this, but only the case where it's combined with others to produce a product, right? So this commodity here, we know that it will be used to produce a product. We define three types: means of production, which are the ones that when you use it in production, you also need to buy the stuff that reproduces it. So for example, to give an example, if I have a machine, I need to buy the fuel, and machine and fuel will be used to produce the product. But both of them need to be bought by money, right? So we define private means of production as the case where the machine is the product of other commodities, and when you use it, what it needs to exist is also bought. So its reproduction happens inside of production. We call natural means of production the case where you're using, for example, land, and land is not the product of other commodities. It came from the outside of the commodity world. But when you buy land, you also buy fertilizer for the land. Everything that reproduces the land needs to be bought for production as well. And then you can use it to produce a product. But it's a fictive commodity, right? And the third case, which is labor, it's the case where labor power is not a commodity by nature, right? It's not the product of commodity production. And when you buy labor, you don't need to buy the means of reproduction of labor. So I only buy labor. I don't buy food for the laborer. I buy other stuff and I use it to produce a product. And the laborer then goes outside and buys his means of subsistence elsewhere. So this fact distinguishes labor from other natural means of production. And this fact distinguishes means of production, natural means of production, and labor from the private means of production. So only looking at the arrows, using the concepts we already had, we have enough to see the difference between labor and means of production only from the commodity producing arrows. If you just look at these arrows and the different ways they can be combined, you can already distinguish these three things. And so you see, we introduce labor in this way because it has a singularity, because of the arrows that go inside and outside of it, without ever talking about human nature. If you find any other commodity that behaves like this, it would be like labor. So for example, I gave the example of, let's say, the robot Bender from Futurama. He's recognized by the state as a citizen, so he can bear money and exchange. And you don't buy the fuel for the robot, but the robot needs to use the money to go to the market to buy his food. In that sense, Bender is working. He sells his labor time, but the guy who buys it doesn't buy the fuel for Bender, and Bender needs to buy the fuel with the money that he got from production by going in the market and buying it, right? So after all of that, we ended last time on this point, right? We now have, at this point, we can say that we know that we know how to call this, right? Which we said that capital sees this difference in money quantities. We said that money that is caught up in as capital, it can see that that production is an important dimension because it's going to use commodities, combine them with other commodities to produce a product. And we were able to at least name or see the difference between some of these commodities, because not all of them behave the same with regards to this little equation here, right? So we know that labor and means of production are different, but we only saw this in terms of how they behave with production arrows, how they compose and how they are composed of other stuff. We don't know how they behave in terms of value. And that's what the capitalist is interested, right? The capitalist says, okay, fine, I will accept that from the standpoint of production, LP is different from MP. But I don't care about this. I care of the question, will the value that is here be transferred? I bought these things for the same value of M1, right? Can I combine these things in such a way that the product is worth more than them? Is it possible? Is there any way to see this, right? So that's the question that this section tries to answer. And we start by showing, which I think is a very nice idea, is that the concept that Marx introduces in the first chapter, he calls concrete labor and abstract labor, which is like this huge discussion in Marxism. What is abstract labor? Where does it come from? Is it a mental abstraction? Who abstracts? How is it abstract, or something like this? We find a nice answer to this, because if you're looking at, let's say, labor that is going to be mixed with other commodities, and this is going to give you a product, right? In general, as Dennis was saying, when you have an arrow like this, right, It can be any possible way of doing it. It just means all the ways that you can get to the product, right? See the product with that labor, power, and those commodities. So if I got like a bunch of paper and I get this guy or myself doing it, and there are thousands of ways that I can create some origami with the paper, turn the paper into origami, right? There are infinite ways of doing that. So that unconstrained arrow of infinite ways of composing labor with means of production, we call concrete labor. And if you add now the other arrow on top, you can agree that these arrows are constraining this, right? If you have these arrows here, they are saying, I will only accept those arrows here that make this other process true, right? I will only accept ways of turning paper into origami that are such that the value of the origami will be higher than the value that I pay for labor and paper. So it's like if I'm the laborer here, it's like I have millions of ways of doing stuff to get to the product, right? But when I have this input from M1 and I know that there is an output from P to M2 and this needs to commute, the equation needs to balance, let's say. Well, there is only this way from all of those that really does it. So when you add these arrows, this way here, or perhaps this and this way are singled out, and the others are abstracted from. They're removed, right? They don't do what we want the labor to do. So and we call this restriction by adding these arrows and the information that they restrict these arrows to be. That's what we call abstract labor. So in our situation, in our version, abstract labor is a differentiation of concrete labor, not an indifferentiation. Abstract labor are the real activities that guarantee the value transfer to the product. They're not, let's say, a different way of looking at production from the standpoint of circulation, as if you're now a guy in the market looking back at production. It's the actual act of transformation restricted to only those real transformations that preserve value. So to go back to what Caron says, this is exactly what we have here, right? Abstract labor is therefore not a mental abstraction from different concrete activities, but a class of real activities where effort is not spent in view of material transformation of things, albeit this remains its medium, but is guided by the concern or the criteria with at least preserving the value of productive consumables in the output. It is, in other words, real labor that sees value rather than only use, right? It looks as the paper as the means to transfer value to the origami. It doesn't look at paper as I can do whatever with the paper, I will do the origami that I want. So you see, rather than going, the usual way of talking about this is saying there is concrete work. Abstract labor is the reconsideration of concrete work from the indifferent standpoint. I don't care what you did because what I care about is the value. So it's kind of a mental removal, a distancing. In our approach, you abstract into the real world, not out of it. You go further into the operations that can be done, the work that can be done, towards those ways of working that will guarantee an added condition, right? So abstract labor is concrete labor plus something, and not concrete labor minus something, which is very good because it's a truism that many Marxists say, which is absurd, that capitalists don't care about use value. I mean, and this leads us to say things like we are on the side of the use, the real use of things, and capitalists are abstract thinkers who don't care about reality, which is absurd. Capitalists are trying to extract the precise use, not any use. In that sense, you might say they are not very artistic, they're not exploring the possibilities, but on the contrary, nobody looks more at what the fuck use is than these guys. They like, okay, but from the myriad of possibilities, is there any way that value can transfer to the product, right? So I think that, in my opinion, this is actually, I've seen other authors talk about abstract labor in this way, but I think it's a very easy way to understand. Once you understand what we talk about arrows, and arrows meaning that you need, the more arrows you add, the more the meaning of the arrows becomes refined. That's a good way of understanding this in this case, right? You have concrete labor as all the ways LP can be composed with MP to turn into a product. And you have abstract labor as a restriction, so it's part of concrete labor. In the case where this happens, true, but more than this, the exchange value of the product is larger than the exchange value of LP plus MP. So you added this condition. And the fact that you see it in circulation or you see it in production, it's secondary, right? That's already a subjectivist approach, because then we start wondering, where is this difference felt for the capitalist? I took my commodity to the market and there I saw that it wasn't as valuable, and then I had to come back to production. That's secondary. And a big part of capitalist production is precisely managing to sense if value is being transferred inside the production process. So to give a stupid example, right? If you are going to create a big budget movie, you're going to do test screenings before you finish the movie. But that's secondary. If you found out the value at the end or in the beginning, that's a subjective part. The objective logic is intrinsic to labor. It's not extrinsic. So this is nice, I think. And we can distinguish something which is going to be very important just in a second, which is the following. Like, this definition doesn't require money to have become more money. So let's consider the first case where you just preserve, right? I bought labor, I bought means of production, I did everything right. Like, you still need to be very careful in what you do so that the product has the same value, right? That's already abstract labor. Abstract labor doesn't require that you produce something more valuable. It's what we call value transferring labor. It's done with view of transferring the value, but it's true, you can transfer more than the word. So this is even further refined. So more specific one that will transfer more, but we need to define what that difference is. So we don't need surplus, because we haven't seen any surplus yet, to define abstract labor. We just need the possibility of transferring the value of the consumables to the product. And then we can already see the difference between concrete and abstract labor, right? And then comes, yeah.
At this point, would it be inconsistent at the level of concrete labor to say that it was from the beginning present in every commodity preserving operation?
That's concrete labor or abstract labor?
Concrete labor is in any commodity preserving operation. You have some amount of concrete labor. Like,
no, because
them from the,
for example, you don't need that, because, for example, if you define exchange as the case where you have one commodity and the other, and the use sets are preserved, right? They don't change, right? If I exchange these two commodities, they cannot change their use. Their composition is preserved. So exchange doesn't require labor, because exchange doesn't change the use of commodities. But all commodity producing arrows, sorry, perhaps I didn't understand your question.
Yeah, no, I think you're going, so all commodity producing arrows do take amount of concrete labor.
Yeah, but then yeah, I think the point is this, like, let's distinguish between commodity preserving, which means, for example, I bought all the paper to turn it into origami. I did a very crappy job. The origami is terrible. It's valued less than the paper, but it's still a commodity. There is some idiot that can buy the origami very cheap, but it can buy it. So it preserves the commodity form. It has use and exchange value, but not the same, right? So we can distinguish commodity preserving, which it just preserves the form. It guarantees that it's exchangeable. Value preserving, which guarantees that the value of the products was also transferred, not only the form, the output is a commodity, but more than this, right? The output is a commodity and it has the same value as the things that went inside of it. So perhaps we could say that I don't think that it's necessary that every transformation that the output is a commodity, that it takes labor. For example, if you buy a wine, buy a crappy wine, leave it just fermenting a bit more, it becomes a bit better.
Yeah.
Or I mean, it doesn't become better, it becomes worse, but you sell the worst wine, right? It changed due to entropy, perhaps. I think that should be a possibility. But the idea that the wine will acquire more value, so you will transfer more value or transfer value of other products into the value of the finished product, that's where labor is specific. Labor would be specific in that, as we will see, it can transfer, it can control the transfer of value to the product. And so it's not just random, which already makes it singular, that you can work in ways that preserve value. And then it's even more singular because it can help increase how much value is transferred to the product. Let's say it's not necessary that labor is employed, but there are very good reasons to employ.
But when you say that the theory is not ontological, doesn't ontologizes labor, then what do you like? What does that imply?
That implies that what we're calling labor is not something defined in itself, is defined by the arrows in the theory.
Okay.
Right? So it's logical. It's a logical category that there is some commodity whose arrows give it a certain property. The property that, because it's, and we will see why, but it's not ontological. It's not a matter of creativity.
But it's not to deny that it is general in the sense of being part of the compositional activity of commodities, right?
Yeah, but again,
general.
I think this is the issue. One of the issues we're going to address now, because usually we explain it in this way, which I think is the ontological way. Labor is very special because labor is the name of a special property we have of creation. Because labor is what makes us humans, everything that is human will have labor. So capitalism, being also a human thing, will also have labor. And because labor is special, it will also have a special role in capitalism. So the special singular aspect comes from what labor is. And then we arrive at capitalism. In our approach is the inverse. You have commodities, you have the commodity production arrows. They are much more general than labor. They apply to everything. And then once you look at, we define labor to be something. It doesn't mean to be human, doesn't mean to be whatever. We don't know what it is. To be something that has certain properties that fit the concepts we already have. And the properties we have thus far are, it's not the product of commodity production. It's not reproduced inside the production process. And because, and like every use set, in fact, of every commodity, there are ways of using that use set, of composing with an object that are not value preserving, and ways of composing with that object that are value preserving. But that's actually not singular in itself, right? It becomes singular because of the other property. So once we see the consequence of these other properties, because if labor is not a commodity, so the value of it doesn't come from its production, and its reproduction is not happening when you use it, happening outside of the production, the value of labor, which comes from the commodity quantities associated with it, right, is detached from its use. And that's the logical reason why we call it creative. It's not creative in any beautiful sense. It's just that the forms of use of this commodity are detached of the value of that commodity. So that's a logical description. Now, once you describe this as this category of things, labor power, God knows what else can have that capacity. Once you define it like that, and you know it's like every commodity, it can transfer value, and it can transfer more value than it's worth. We're going to see in a bit why. Well, it's very probable that it will be quite ubiquitous in production, right? It's a good reason to use it. But that doesn't mean that there are not transformational processes that happen without labor. There can be. So you see, like the order of the reasons is inverted. You define the singularity of it, and then, okay, I accept it's probably very general, the use of it. But it's not because it is necessarily so that it is ubiquitous. It's logically coherent with the space, right? That it's very used.
Yeah, I mean, it turns out to be general without having any anthropomorphical like character that is associated with this creativity, this creation. And I think this distinction between the way that creation of value is dissociated with this general creation of form is really, it's really useful.
And I mean, and again, we're not talking about this very much right now, but if we recall that thing that we all struggled with, the idea of the use set, right? We call the commodities use set this sort of, imagine that we try to put a difference between there is some substrate, and then within this substrate of all the ways these things it's composed of other things, and it composes other things. Within these many ways, things can be composing it. So atoms are composing something, and it also can participate in the composition of other things, right? So atoms compose some paint, and paint can come into the composition of a painting, composition of the car, the composition of many things. We call the commodity use set of this piece of paint only the arrows that can be seen by the commodity world. Again, so it's the same constraint we talked about of the concrete labor and abstract labor. That very general arrow is reduced to the more strict arrow of value. This is like a previous version of that, where all the ways of composing this stuff are restricted to the ones that concern commodity preservation, right?
Yeah.
So this is nice because this applies to labor. You can imagine that there is some substrate, which is not even called labor. It's everything that composes a person and that the person composes, right? This involves both physical form, social relations with other people, every fucking thing. But from those things, there is a subset we call the use set of labor, which are the uses of labor that are caught up in compositions of commodities, right?
Yeah.
So we actually are logically defining labor out of the universe of possible actions, which might not be commodified at all.
There's activity in general, then there's the first closure, which is the disclosure of concrete labor, which is commodity preserving, and then there's the second closure, which is value preserving.
Yeah,
instead of objective.
Yeah, exactly. And again, for example, if we have a different object, and for that you would need a very different logic, we could, for example, see many of the arrows that are not commodity preserving. For example, if we're looking at energy costs, right? We can suddenly see many things about a person that might not even make them look like an individual, because you're constantly meshed with other systems. So for example, a more organizational point of view could recast this labor object as something totally different, right? Simply by restricting it in a way that doesn't respect the commodity world. takes other constraints into view, right? So it's very kind of natural to imagine sort of subversions of labor into different ways at looking at labor, right? It's kind of building to it.
Just a side note, just for notation wise, we already defined these closures in terms of the functors. So we have this O notation. O notation here, which says O is all commodity preserving maps between A and B. And then we also had this CU notation, which is all use maps between A and B. And then we had CL, which I think could all, we don't do it here, but we could also write it as in this same format, all concrete labors that have A as input and B as output, and then finally abstract labor. So just to show that the way we use set theory here is as a way of tracking the logical restrictions. So we start with the most general set of operations, and then we restrict down to the ones we care about. I think we could probably do a better job of in this text of connecting these more, but in here we just call it a set. We say CL is a set and then AL is a subset like this, but really it's they're in categorical terms they are functors that they're ways of seeing our category and looking for the maps that we care about.
Yeah, I think actually this here, right, already helps to see that what we're calling abstract labor, right? This kind of expands it, right? That you had all those ways of composing new products, but when you add this arrow here, right, what we're doing is that we're interested in the monetary value of MP and LP. And we want the product to be such that the value of the product is larger than the value of the parts that went into it. So this is a kind of an expanded way to see how we're constraining this arrow from all those ways to a few ways, right?
Exactly, yeah. That's the right half. And then the left half just shows that among all commodities which can see this process happening, there is one special commodity, which is actually more of a version of the commodity LP, which is measurable in terms of hours.
Yeah, actually, at this point, we haven't defined that yet, right? We're gonna show that now.
Yeah, I mean, it's in this section that we we define LPA, yeah. But this is also important. Again, we see the same object can have multiple existences. So LPA and LP are just variations of the same, kind of the same thing, but seen in different contexts.
Yeah, so you see, for example, this arrow here, like this combination of arrows clarifies, right, that this thing here is, so this arrow here needs to be such that this other arrow for the value of the products with regards to the value of the things that went inside of it obtains, but at the same time, this means that there must be a kind of a way of seeing LPU as this other version of use, a restricted version of use, that if it brings its value to the production process, it preserves the values in the output.
Yeah, also the homomeric property is important here because this M, like we said earlier, is homomeric, meaning we can slice it in half and it will still be money, right? We can, and no matter how you divide money, it remains money. So the same property is inherited in this.
Yeah, so this is actually what
subject.
comes after. Now, after we define this thing, we define two things that are important. One is what we call the labor value point of view, which is the fact that if labor is in every, if labor goes into the production of every value transferring operation, in every operation that did manage to transfer the value, then it should be possible to translate or kind of rewrite the production process of commodities in terms of the labor that went into them. So to kind of project every commodity composition from the standpoint of the labor that went into all of those processes, right? But I think that the really important part is this one that exemplifies the thing we were talking about in the beginning. Like this is, I think, a new idea. So our idea is to say, well, we show that there is a restriction of labor called abstract labor that is defined by the money arrows in the productive process, right? By the preservation of value. How does this appear? How can it appear for labor itself? So you see, this is the same problem that we had before with commodities. We had many commodities. We say that consistent exchange amongst them shows that they have the same value. And then you want to ask, but how does this value, this invariance, appear to commodities? And that leads you to money, right? So we came up with a way of applying the logic of value form to the logic of labor time, to derive labor time in the same way that we derive the money form. Again, this is not in Marx because Marx assumes that labor, like there is, that concrete labor exists as time, and that abstract labor also exists as time, and then the social average of the total product divided by the labor that went into it will give you the average social necessary time. So time is presupposed in the whole process. You don't arrive at time. In the same way that you don't arrive at quantity. Quantity is presupposed, as if every way of mediating or reading the social space, economic social space, would be quantifiable. So we try to derive time out of the things that came before. So I think that this is something we're still working on in a bit, but I think that it's already useful. So you start by fixating a commodity. So we're imagining that you have some labor with some means of production, and there is some product. Let's fixate this product here, right? We know that this product preserved the value, right? So there can be many ways to do this, right? There can be many combinations of means of production and labor, which make it so that when you combine the two, you get the product, right? Let's restrict this. Let's only look at those combinations such that the exchangeability of C is at least that of the combination of MP with LP, meaning this little diagram here, right? So now we want to ask, how does this value transfer, how does this LPA, we call, right, this abstract transfer, which is a restriction on all the ways of using labor, how can this particular form of labor appear to the laborers, right? So again, it's like constructing an average for the social labor, for the type of labor that transfers the value. You want to see how it looks, right? So we call accidental labor use, playing with the accidental form of value, right? We call accidental labor use the case where, considering the previous conditions, so keeping the exchange of value, the transfer of value stable, two different labors, LP1 and LP2, are compared with regards to their value transfer uses, right? So it's like comparing these two labors and saying, yeah, one transferred the value more than the other. Or let's imagine now here we have two laborers, right? LP1 and LP2. Both of them were employed in this process. you can look at this one and say, yeah, when I compare the two, they're kind of different. They didn't do the same thing. They didn't do it the same way. I know they transferred, the total value was transferred to the product, but I don't know who did or which way of working did. I just know that comparing the two, they're different, right? So, but we can expand the accidental comparisons by fixating one of the compared labor uses. So for example, imagine that there are other workers, so LP3 here as well, right? And rather than comparing 1 and 2, and then 2 and 3, I can compare all of them to 1. And I can say something like, this guy worked more like the first, whereas the third worked less like him. So LP2 is more like LP1 than LP3. Right? Let's put some, I think with the names, it might be easier, right? So for example, this guy is Arthur, Brian, and I don't know, Carl, right? So you would say, yeah, Arthur and Brian worked kind of the same, but Arthur and Carl worked very differently, right? So you create a fixation and you compare from the standpoint of one, right? So you expanded the comparisons, right? We cannot make quantitative judgments, but we can say that several individual labors are more or less equivalent to regards with the to value transfer to the product, right? And in the specific case of the atomic component of Arthur, the first labor, we can only say other labors are more or less Arthur-like. And this actually is very important because in very basic manufacture, and in fact in the Soviet Union, this was used as this literally was used as a measure of labor. They built a statue to a guy called Stenkov. I forget his full name, Stenkovich. What's does anyone remember the name of the guy with the statue? Let me see if this can. Yeah, Stenkov, I don't know his name, this guy here. Stenkov became famous because he was a model worker, and other workers were encouraged to be more Stenkov-like. So you don't have a metric for labor in a quantitative sense, but it doesn't mean there aren't other metrics for labor in the meanwhile that you can use, right? So you can say, for example, that Carl and Brian are more Arthur-like in their labor, or less Arthur-like. They work more like Stenkov or less, right? Recall that this looks a lot like the expanded equivalent, expanded relative form of value. Remember when we had X, A, and then we compared other commodities to 1, right? X of A equal, and then you have a list of other commodities that are of the same value. This is something like this, right? We have Arthur, and then the list of other guys. Brian is more like him, Carl is less like him, and so on and so forth. So you still don't have a quantitative outlook, but you already have a sort of ordering or partial ordering of how you evaluate people with regards to one person in terms of their capacity to transfer value, right? So we call social necessary labor use, not yet labor time. So the socially necessary form of use that you need to do to create a commodity, to transfer value to a commodity C. This predicate, which can be any predicate, we don't know what it is, but it's a predicate such that not only, let me erase here, not only does you had this comparisons between Arthur and C, right? This is less, this is more, but you can come up with this other predicate here that it can see all these relations, right? It will preserve this, but from the standpoint of a new predicate. So for example, what would be the difference in this case? Diligency. Arthur was diligent. That's the predicate we were comparing. Therefore, in terms of diligency, Brian was more like Arthur and Carl was less like Arthur. But now I can also include Arthur in the mixture. He's not our I. We're not using him as our measure, right? But that doesn't need to be time. It can be anything. But, so we arrive at a measure that is immanent to the production process, that is allowing us to compare how well labors are transferring value, but we still don't have a quantitative way. We can only say that everyone is diligent to the p degree, more or less diligent, right? So now we want to derive the quantity. We want to arrive at time as the measure. Why is labor time the measure for labor in capitalism? Remembering that this was not always the case. This is a historical thing. It's not true that, for example, slaves were being beaten because of temporal measures in ancient Greek. They might have been seen in terms of other characteristics, other predicates of what it means to do good labor, not good labor, or whatever, right? So how do we arrive at time? If we go back to our arrows, exactly what Dennis was saying, right? If you go back to this, there is one other property. Like we already saw that we're interested in the labor, we call abstract labor, that transfers value to the product. We already showed that given many laborers, we can come up with a predicate that sees these labors in terms of their capacity to transfer the product. But there is one property of money that we didn't transfer into, we didn't refine our view of production to include that property, which is what Dennis was saying, the Homomeric property. That money doesn't simply compare value, right? This is more valuable than that. It orders the comparisons in a total ordering, meaning that if you compare two, one is either bigger or smaller than the other, right? That property, our predicate, for example, diligency, might not still be totally ordered. So what we are looking for is the question, is there a property, is there a dimension in the use set of labor? Is there something about labor that is like that property of money, of being homomeric, of being quantitatively shifting without shifting in quality? And there is time. Time is an aspect of labor that is homomeric. If I spend 2 hours, that's 2 hours. If I split 2 hours in half, it's still time. If I split half of that time in half, it's still time, and vice versa. So if I substitute SLNU, right, socially necessary labor use, for a measure of time, socially necessary labor time, I will have constructed something that respects the properties of the arrows coming in and out of labor. It adds another restriction to labor based on that predicate. So
yeah, so it's like SNLU is the way that Stakhanov would work.
Yeah.
And SNLT is how long would Stakhanov take to make this thing.
Exactly. So you see, again, time is a predicate. It's not an ontological dimension. Labor time for us is just the logical, it's just a predicate that fits some logical properties that we need. If we're trying to see in labor properties of value, well, value is totally ordered by money. So we want to see that total order in labor. So what about labor has that property? Right? Half of a diligent time is not diligent, it's lazy. But half of 2 hours is 1 hour, and that's still the same quality of measure. Right? So we managed to use once more the value form as a logic, a predicative logic for seeing as something, and time is just the particular way of seeing labor that fits all the constraints in this logic. It has no metaphysical reason, Heideggerian reason, because time is the being of the world. Not at all, right? And it doesn't even mean chronological time in the physical sense. It means chronological time in the specific sense of political economy, which is it has some properties of chronological time, but not others. So for example, the first appearance of the socially necessary labor time is not as a clock, but it's probably a song, as music, because work songs, which organize the time of production in terms of pulses that has some relatively similar duration, came decades, centuries before the invention of a clock, right? And in fact, Moishe Postoni suggests that clocks were only properly invented. The problem of clocks was much more interesting because socially, we wanted to refine the predication of the available way of measuring labor time, right? So I mean, Marxists, we always love to do that and say that every invention is caused by the needs of production, but in this case, there is a very interesting way to talk about how a particular way of looking at time is born out of the constraints of capitalist production. So you see, with this weird approach, we don't need to answer a question that we can answer a question that Marx didn't answer. Marx never explains why labor time is the way you measure your average social use of labor. He never explains, he presupposes it, just as much as he presupposes the quantity-quality distinction. I think our take on this is that he presupposes it because it's obvious for us, but that doesn't mean it's obvious for commodities. Once you take that presupposition out and you ask, how do I arrive at quantities? Why are quantities relevant? And how are they relevant? Or you ask, how is labor time? How does it become such an obvious way of measuring things? Then you need to derive it. And we show that you can derive it using the same fucking logic, the same process that we derive the money form, we derive labor time. And there's something else which is really important, which is this is a scale sensitive way of deriving it. Because remember we said, consider a product P, right? We said something like this, yeah, labor power with MP for a product P. We fixated this and we asked, well, given this, for this product, how do you see the different laborers here, right? Imagine you're not fixating on one product, but fixating on a sector that produces products. The way that the more or less this average will be constructed for example, a total production of a commodity or a total sector of commodity might lead to different ways of seeing labor, right? So there can be actually, and this is something that some Marxists are discussing today, there can be more than one metric for social necessary labor time. Social necessary labor time at equilibrium prices and social necessary labor time at disequilibrium prices, right? So, for example, the necessary labor time when commodities are sold at their value is one. But when you consider the totality of capitalist production and you introduce prices of production, market prices, and so on, it's not the inner value, but the price that is the relevant measure. So what socially necessary labor time looks from that perspective of that structure might be different. So this theory allows us to explore that. We don't do it here, but if we want it, it has the basic machinery already in place. Right, and so only after all of this do we have, like, after 11 propositions, so Marx introduces labor time in the second page of Capital. It takes us 33 pages to be able to say, it's like Bertrand Russell with the Principia, you know, like takes 200 pages to see 1 + 1 = 2. It takes us 33 pages to say that you can measure abstract labor in labor hours, right? Social necessary labor has a quantitative description. So at the end of this section, we then can say something that is crucial for all everything that comes after. I mean, before I say this, there's actually something important to talk about in this sense, because Marx says that the magnitude of value is totally determined by social necessary labor time. So this is let's say the main reason why we tend to think that labor determines value in a sort of almost mechanical sense of feed forward. Something happens to labor and then happens to value. The determination of the magnitude is determined by labor. In our construction, you can see that everything happens at once. Because it's value transferring, then you can arrive at labor time as a measure, right? We kind of constructed a correlation, if you stop to think about it. We're saying that abstract labor is to labor, social necessary labor time, as value is to money, right? Because I'm just going to add time here to be easier. Because time can be divided into quantities in a way that money can be divided into quantities. But this allows us to correlate hours with quantities, and this will be isomorphic, right? Because the structure of time, of labor time, has the structure of money. In that sense of being homomeric, we talked about. Quantitative changes don't affect the quality, right? And different labor hours can be correlated to uses of abstract labor. Okay, but you could say this is a correlation, not a determination. Who said that just because there is a metric for value inside of production, that this metric exclusively determines magnitude of value, right? Why can I say that this precedes this? And again, there is the ontological answer to this, which would imply that labor is the building force of the world, therefore it precedes value as a given, right? But there is another way of defining this. I think Dennis found a nice way to talk about this, which is the following. Going back to our extensive metaphor of extensions like measuring heights, right? We have a ruler that allows us to compare the size of this tree and the size of this tree. And using this ruler, we can assign specific points to these different trees, right? Like you can put a ruler here and say this tree is here, this tree is here, right? What we constructed with labor time is actually a dynamic measure of how much labor transfers to the product, right, of value. So let's imagine that rather than being, I don't know, a botanist that studies tree heights, I'm a dendrologist that studies the water intake by the roots. I can look at how much nutrients the plant receives, and I can correlate that with the height. I can say plants that receive less nutrients remain smaller. Plants that get more nutrients from the ground becomes taller, right? And I'm correlating this minus with this minus, and this plus with this plus. Why would the dendrologist say, as they probably would, that the intake of energy of the plant is determining the size? It's not because of ontology, it's because of the logic of it. I can describe the heights in terms of the roots. Just by looking at the energy intakes in the roots, I can describe the heights. So the measures are correlates, but one of them can be used without the other being there. And the inverse is not true. So I think we wrote this somehow here. I just want to see how we wrote it.
Was it in the conclusion, maybe?
Yeah, the conclusion has, I just wanted to see if we had the, if we had a, yeah, we don't even mention it here. We're being ridiculously condensed at this point. But I mean, I would say that for the sake of our argument, you would say labor time determines the magnitude of value simply because it is a different way of cutting the commodity world, that without the product being there, you already have the measure that correlates with the product, right? The same way that I can look at the roots and tell something about the height of the tree, but the causal language of if this is happening, that will happen, is more of a, it still depends on the correlation of the two metrics, right? That I can model things about heights and translate those statements in terms of statements about energy intake. But that doesn't necessarily require you to say that roots came before trees, especially because the roots depend on the tree size to have their own size, right? So you can have a circular argument, but still make causal statements.
Yeah, so this is just a counter argument to those who might say that switching money for labor time is just a matter of switching rulers. You're just choosing one measure over another, and really, because like we said, it's isomorphic between money and time, there's no real benefit to using time over money as a measure, right?
Yeah, like Proudhon wanted to have like labor time money, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so our counter argument is that actually time captures something about the causal direction of commodities, right? It's actually labor time causing value instead of simply measuring it.
Yeah, but I think that for me, the interesting thing about that is that you can talk about cause, but that doesn't mean ontological precedence. It just means that it gives you a more universal way of talking than the localized one. There's something we didn't add here that I think is actually very important, very interesting, which is that there is actually an asymmetry between the two, because money commodities have constraints that labor time doesn't, in the sense that labor is employed everywhere and determines magnitudes of value that are expressed in different currencies with different conditions. So it seems more universal on the one hand. On the other hand is the contrary, because we had to determine which product we're talking about to determine the social necessary time for that product. So on the other hand, labor is more relative to something else than money is as a measure. So it's like labor seems universal, but it's always heterogeneous, whereas money is more homogeneous, but is also more constrained. Anyway, I think that there are still ways of presenting that part of the argument that will be clearer. I think that the derivation of labor time is quite consistent, but the explanation as to why labor time can be said to determine without it being ontologically necessary that it do so, it's still something that I think requires a better argument. But I think we still have time to go to this thing, which is at this point here, all we did was to define labor time, abstract labor, value preservation, right? The fact that you can preserve and transfer value to the product. But we need a slightly different machinery to start talking about how do you transfer and how can different quantities be transferred. And this is, we went and looked for this different formalism called an operad, which allows us to talk in more detail about this thing that we previously were writing just like this. Right? So this thing here, you compose the two and they give you a product. How do you compose them? Right? And the operad allows you to really kind of look into this thing here and open it up and see that there are many ways of doing it. So in this section, I think we only introduced what an operand is, right?
Yeah, we can talk about it in terms of this picture, this black box, right? Instead of one arrow, so this box represents one arrow from A to B, with the caveat that A can actually be a set of things, right? So we actually have many inputs that go in, that are A consists of. And we explain how this is consistent, right? But in category theory, every arrow can be decomposed into smaller arrows, right? Because I think we already talked about this in another meeting, that if you have an arrow from here to here and you have an arrow from here to here, you can draw a composed arrow from those two, right? That's like one of the basic operations. So the operand takes that idea and adds kind of a two-dimensional version of it, because if we think of this is the diagram I drew here is purely sequential composition. But here you can see that we have P1 and P2 as kind of two parallel boxes. If each one of these are considered to be arrows, we can see that the operand is a way of allowing us to specify how these arrows connect to each other to form this larger A to B arrow. Yeah, and the language of this is, it's much easier if you just think about it as boxes with input and output wires. So every box has some inputs, which are these, and outputs. And then the composition is just a rule for how to connect the input and output wires such that certain laws must be satisfied, right? But basically, every output must be the input of another box.
Yeah. So, for example, if you have LP composing with means of production, you could say, for example, that there are two laborers here, and that inside of MP you have some, let's say, two tools. And you could then assign, therefore, LP1 and MP1, LP2 and MP2. Then you have a product of labor with the tool or whatever, the material, right? And this product, for example, is going with this other product into this process. And something remains up here. This leads to a new product that also a subproduct of this is mixed with it, or for example, labor. The same laborer is applied here, and he turns this into the final product. Right? So you can decompose this, which was just one arrow, right, into a much more detailed process. And what these guys show is that this is treating it in this way is consistent with the previous formalism. So this is not like an extrinsic thing. This is something that you can bring into the picture and it works fine. And I think that one of the really cool things about it, that is, if you look at this queue here, it shows something that is implied, but it's one of the crucial parts, right? This four boxes, right? With these two things coming into this, and then these two things coming into this and this coming out, right? You could erase everything and treat this whole thing as a box. We call Q, right? Or the inverse. If there are relevant ways of doing it, you can imagine turning this into, for example, these two things don't come straight into a box. There's a previous box here for both of them, and then they go into this. You can decompose this box, for example, into three boxes, right? So this nesting process, it's allowed until you restrict it to the appropriate ones, right? If you're showing this with this number of boxes, it's not because ontologically they are only four processes, but because logically the relevant differences, let's say, can be divided into four processes, right? But there could be further ways of decomposing. Not sure if that was clear.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the previous comment that whereas in previous forms of capital, we had to kind of cheat to make surplus, right? We had to go into a different layer, like the contract layer or the community layer, and somehow index our commodities in some different way to produce the surplus. This is the way that capitalism produces surplus. It's by going into these boxes and finding ways of combining labor power and means of production. But this process of zooming into a box and decomposing it into other boxes, it can be approached very, scientifically, or approached in a very like mechanical way, even to find sources of waste, for example, or sources of inefficiencies, and then eliminating those inefficiencies, or speeding up certain boxes and or combining boxes together, which I think we're going to talk about in the.
I think that, honestly, just I'm not sure what you think. Like, I suggest that we skip this section. We're not hoping to explain Capital, the book, as well. We want to present our own project. So I think that we could skip this and just show different ways of using the operand,
Yeah.
Just so we can see how these things can work, for example. And later on, we can go back to these things if you guys are interested. We provide some examples of how surplus can be extracted, but basically, after we presented the operand, what this section just does is that it shows why it is that, from the compositional point of view, machines can only transfer their own value, or means of production can only transfer their own value, while labor can transfer more than its own value. And the explanation for this, again, it's logical and not based on any ontological category. We show that, remember that means of production, specifically private means of production, are those that have commodity arrows coming in because they're the product, and then they are part of the production process, right? That means that inside of the means of production, inside of the use set of means of production, there are actually arrows coming from the use set of other commodities that went into its making. So when you now use this use set, I'm simplifying radically, okay, but just for the sake of it, when you use this use set to transfer value, the exchange sets of the stuff that went into the means of production will constrain how much value it can add to the product. They cannot transfer more than what is valued, because the parts of the mean of production are constrained by commodity arrows that go into it. So something that is the product of capitalist production cannot make anything more valuable than it is. So if I buy $100,000 machine, it can only transfer $100,000 to the product in a long cycle of use, right? Now, remember that in the case of labor power, its exchange, the means of subsistence that it needs are not directly the thing that are not bought by the capitalist as well, right? You can see the machine has these two things coming inside, and also the fuel that composes with it, so that it can transfer value. But this is also bought by the capitalist. This was also paid for, and this was also paid for previously, right? In the case of labor power, the means of subsistence are not commodity producing. When labor power composes with means of subsistence, it produces itself. It doesn't produce something else, and it doesn't happen inside the commodity production. So the only thing that measures it, the only arrows coming into labor power, are the arrows not of the commodities that went into its making, but of the means of subsistence that need to be bought to reproduce labor. So the value of labor is determined by the value of this means of production, this means of subsistence. But there can be things inside of labor that are not those means of subsistence, because labor was not the product of commodity production, right? Remember, these are the two conditions that we had. I forgot to write the main one, right? That the use set of labor came from outside of the commodity world. So there are no commodity arrows going to this use. And its exchange set comes from the means of subsistence that it needs. But not everything came from those means, right? They just reproduce something that was never produced by capitalism, which means that there might be ways of mobilizing labor that exceed the value of its means of subsistence. So the reason for us to say that labor can transfer more value than it has, right? The reason why for capital, labor appears as variable capital, it's because on the one hand, it is not a product of capital. So it has things which are not capital, or which are not commodity, which are not priced, right? And even its pricing doesn't happen inside the commodity world, commodity sphere, production sphere. It happens in the consumption sphere. So the determinations of its value are constrained outside of production, and inside of production, labor brings a use set that has more things than the commodity arrows that went into its making, which are priced. So you pay for the labor to remain alive, but what you're buying is a use set that is not constrained by some value boundary, because its parts are not made of value. So you can both use it to no use, right? You can use it poorly and nothing happens, but you can also use it wisely, so to say, and do things to it that are not constrained by its own value. So basically, this section talks about this to explain why, using that, all the distinctions we made thus far, labor can be said to produce more or to transfer more value than it's worth. And then we arrive at this section, which is how is surplus really extracted? And I'm just going to skip what is relative and absolute surplus extraction. Those are important things, but we can see how the operette works, which is nice. So the most basic way to change the value of labor is this one, which is called the cooperation of constant capital. Cooperation of constant capital doesn't change the value of, doesn't make more surplus for that production process where constant capital cooperated, but it makes more surplus for the next production process. So, but it's good just to see how we can represent this with the operette. So, for example, you had two separate processes, X1 and X2. Some labor went into them, some material, and some what we call a workspace, right? Some land or whatever. These three things are combined to the laborer comes on the other side, a product comes on the other side, and the land is still usable, right? And the same is valid here. So the capitalist might create a cooperation of means of production by making two processes work with the same land. For example, rather than pay for a guy to work there and a guy to work there, I buy both labors, I buy both tools, and I put them to work in one place. So I spend less means of production to produce the same. So you see, in this case, you have labor, the material, and the means of production are now the same, going to both boxes. And the same material and the other labor. The two boxes are now inside of this bigger box, and the labor comes on the other side, the shared means of production, the other product, and the other labor. So we show that there are many of the processes that Marx calls cooperation and variations in how organization happens in the production process can be defined in this way. So, for example, this is what's called parallel cooperation. You have labor power and means of production going into a process to produce a product, right? And the laborer might be still used in the day. But for example, you can share the means of production. So the material is now processed by 2 laborers at the same time, producing half of the product each. But since they're producing half of the product, they produce it in half of the time, right? So this would be like 4 hours. This now is 2 for each. So you can write this very naturally with this sort of idea. Then we added something which I think is a very cool idea that we have, which is this thing here, which we call a use resolution box. You can see it's a feedback system, right? And it turns a labor use, right? So we already have, we're talking about there are the operation space, there is the concrete labor space, there is the abstract labor, which is value transferring. And within it, there are still many ways of doing things, right? So the resolution box is like a refinement of this. And you see the idea is that when you employ a labor, it goes through a resolution box, it refines its use when it's composed with the means of production. And not only do you produce a product, but you produce a control system on the way that you should work. Right? So you see the idea that there can be a sort of self-regulation of use that refines use based on the process. The process outputs information about how to use your labor. Why is this useful for us? Because this gives a graphical representation to what Bogdanov calls that inner resistance of labor that can be lowered through cooperation. So for example, this is the case where we can talk about this. You had 2 laborers working separately, and my labor is refining itself every time I work, right? The same for this guy. But if we coordinate our actions in the simplest way, for example, by working side by side, either in rivalry or in cooperation, it can be the case where the resolution box is getting the input from both laborers. So the refinement of my labor actually is dependent on both laborers, not one. Bogdanov talks about this explicitly, the idea that a laborer can mimic the way that the other does, and because he externalizes the solution to the problem, the inner resistance, the inner efforts to arrive at the solution lowers, and he can work better. Right? So this would be something like a coordinated cooperation, where you're syncing the use, right? And resolution boxes are also useful to distinguish types of labor. So for example, if you look at this thing here, you can have, for example, a guy who was refining his work in order to turn this thing into a product. But then you have serial cooperation, where one task, so one box, X, is divided into 2 different processes, X1 and X2. So rather than doing the whole thing, for example, making the cookie batter and then cooking the baking the cookie, right, or whatever it's called, someone prepares the mixture and someone cooks the thing, right? So this guy outputs the mixture and this guy outputs the baked cake, right? So the refinement of this labor is conditioned on the particular material that's going into the production, where now this refinement here will be different. I split one resolution box into 2, right? By refining different actions that correspond now to different laborers. But the thing that was split was actually the refinement box itself.
And also X, right? X is split into X1 and X2.
Yeah, exactly. MPU and the PU here became MPU, PU, and PU2, right?
Yeah, so one worker can watch the cookie dough, one worker watches the oven, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and then because they each specialize on that particular task, they're able to do it faster instead of one worker having to watch both the cookie dough and the oven. Yeah.
There is a enrichment of the operette, another structure you can add to it that we didn't use, which is called historical propagators, which is a way of adding dots to the arrows such that they define a certain delay that needs to happen. In this particular case, this would be very helpful because, for example, in this situation, you can see a certain cycle where before this becomes this, you can't really start the process again. For example, if I'm cooking by myself, and this process here has many stages, I need to go through all the stages before I can start again. Whereas once I split this into two, I can start the process in half of the time. Like I mixed some cookie dough, and while the guy's starting to bake it, I'm already mixing the next, right? So we could actually show the saving of time and the time calculus that this allows for by using these propagators, this delay system that we didn't introduce here. I think a lot of the text would benefit from that thing as well. By the way, if we go back to this thing that I already presented here, remember that I mentioned that work songs were a form of socially necessary labor time measure before clocks. They can perfectly fit this schema, right? By singing a song, you can actually synchronize the refinement of the boxes. So there would actually be a great description of the use of pulses to organize the delay systems of a coordinated cooperation through song. If we added here some of those delay things to correlate with pulses in a song. And there are many interesting studies on specifically what sort of rhythmic structures go better with what work. So for example, sea shanties and other forms of song, which have like very strong kind of syncopated rhythm before and then very long pulses kind of later on, they are very good for syncing workers that need to spend a lot of effort, like raising up the, how do you call it, like in the ship, the sail,
right? Yeah.
And then exhale while the sail is going down. So you can see that the structure of the song is isomorphic to the structure of the work of the delay elements in the operette. So we could go really far with this, and it's really interesting. You know, like I've never seen it done in that level of detail. But you can see the operette doing a lot of interesting stuff. This is a structure. It already gets a bit complicated, but I just think it's worth showing. This is what Marx calls manufacture structure, because the difference here is simply that all these different processes, right, that are sometimes the output of one becomes the input of the other. So it's serial composition. Remember, as we saw it, when the output of one becomes the input of the other, and we divide one task amongst many people, together with cooperation of constant capital, because it's only one workspace for all of them. So we can capture the idea of manufacture as a mixture of variable capital or labor cooperation and means of production cooperation. We can capture it very clearly with this sort of operettas. And then we have, oh fuck, okay, we don't have. Let's see if we do have.
Yeah, but I think this is one of the most interesting parts of this whole text is this.
Yeah, this thing's really,
never seen it before.
Yeah, me neither. And you know, like this is something that we should state in our favor. This formalism is very similar to the formalism that is used by American standards for I think it's called the IDEF 0.
Yeah, IDEF. Yeah.
Which is the standard methodology for creating manufacturing processes in American industry. So there is it's a richer, stronger formalism, but it's totally in dialogue with already a very practical tool that engineers use to come up with the structure of production. So after we introduce manufacture, we do something that they don't do. And the reason why they don't do it is because these sort of diagrams, they are not infinitely nested, right? They respect a sort of ontology of entities. So machines are a box, people are processes or whatever. And in our system, you can, as we said, you can open the box as many times as you want, as long as it's logically relevant, right? And that it makes a difference. So we can define the difference between tools and machines using operands. So I'm not sure if this is the best way of doing it, but I think it's okay. So we further extend the resolution box to other objects. There's no reason why only labor has resolution boxes. So we can talk about tools having resolution boxes. So for example, there's a substrate, there is the use set of the tool, and there are those uses of the tool that are relevant to a production process. Those ways of using that are restricted to the production process. So this would be the refining of the use. What would be a tool rather than a machine? Is the case of a means of production that its refinement box is conditioned by the refinement box of labor. So the better use of the tool is determined by the better use of the labor. So a really good hammer doesn't necessarily work good unless you know how to use it, right? So there is a dependency on the use set of how you will restrict the use of means of production by the way that the labor is restricting it. This is not the structure for machines. This is how Marx himself, this is directly based on Marx's description of what a machine is. Like, this is Marx reading Babbage and Watts in 867. I'm sure we can make something better, but I just stayed with what he does. And Marx describes a machine as a box, right? So imagine that you have, like, this is a machine, MPM. It goes into a process, right, with some other material, and a product comes on the other side. If MPM is a machine, that means that this process Y can be unpacked into a bigger box with 3 smaller processes. So that's the first aspect of a machine. It is a wire into a process that can be unpacked into relevant smaller pieces, right? So what are these 3 pieces? Marx calls it the motor system, the transmission system, and the tool system. So what we have here is, there is the machine. I'll talk about this in a bit, right? The machine takes in some fuel, right, for the motor. The energy that the motor extracts from the fuel is transmitted. It needs to be, again, the delay button would be really, really helpful here, because the transmission system is very much connected with turning fuel into workable energy and not just any energy, right? So it's almost like a resolution box here for temporal passing on of energy, so that which is this, so that the tool can transform some material into the product. So the other part of this is that, okay, labor went into this machine. The labor is not, you see, labor is not really going to the same box as where the material is going. But if this was a tool, you would have LP, the tool, and the material going into a box, and you have the product. In the case of machines, you have machine, machine, the material, and labor power. And the machine can be unpacked into several bits. The material goes inside the machine, and labor stays outside. Labor is not, let's say, handling the tool necessarily, right? This also explains why, even though, so the machine can self-regulate, unlike the tool, and labor still has some regulation on the machine, But labor is doubly determined. You see, like the resolution box of labor now is determined by the machine system and not by the material. So in a previous situation, labor, means and tool would go here. So labor is composing with the material. It's feeling the resistance of the material, for example. And this is together with the way of you're using your tool. This would give you the resolution for labor, the refinement, and labor would further refine how the tool comes into play. But the material is connected to labor. In this case, labor is determined by the machine system, but not directly by the material. You're not, let's say, reacting to how the material reacts. You're reacting to how the machine reacts to the material. And that's what you're refining. So you add the extra distance from the tool, right? So with this crazy thing in place, we can construct what a factory looks like.
Well, just what was the difference between the arrow that goes to the right and the one that goes to upwards of labor power? The one that goes to the resolution box of the machine and the one that goes straight to the...
And this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one is just, let's say, you would interpret it as how to use, right? And this is, let's say, how much you use. I think it's something like this, because this is the actual composition of labor with the machine, but this is determined by how, right? So for example, imagine that there is a button here in the machine that goes from 0 to 10, right? But you still need to, let's say, press a button. So for example, the material is going in, you're getting a reaction from how the material is coming out, for example. This is leading you to increase something about the machine, that it's going to change how it internally works, but you still need to press the fucking button in some frequency, right?
Like turn it on.
Yeah, for example. Yeah. So this would be like refining the way the machine works. And this is refining how labor interacts with the machine, right? How labor works. Because this is the resolution box of the machine, right? It's about determining MP, M, delta U. And this delta here is about determining LP, delta U.
Things like maintenance and cleaning and repairing, would that be this? Would that be shown here, like this one?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Everything labor needs to do, every way labor composes with the material on the machine, that's, let's say, the use of labor. But when labor changes something about the machine for the sake of the machine's better functioning, autonomously, right? Like if you change this, you're changing, for example, these processes that don't involve labor. When you change this.
Yeah.
How do you say zelo in English?
Zeal.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, if you...
Yeah, this allows us to talk about zeal.
Yeah.
It can mean more attentive, but it's more general than zeal. But I think that what the idea of, you know, there are many sociologists, anthropologists of labor that are very worried that Marxists treat manual labor as a machine-like thing that you just do it automatically. And these guys, I think, very rightly point to the fact that that there is a whole dimension of labor called the zeal of labor, right? That you need to take some care of what you're doing. There's even a way of making a strike, a strategy for strikes that are removing the zeal. So I just do exactly as it's written in the books. I'm supposed to press the button of the machine. I'm just gonna fucking press it with no concern for what's actually happening, right? So a zeal strike could be, for example, a way of suspending this arrow, which is a sort of self-correcting arrow, right? So even that we can start accounting for, you know? Now, if you simply include this already weird structure, that I think we could talk a bit more about it and discern it better, but I mean, one thing you guys can realize that we never included waste in any of the operettes, right? It's only the product and no waste. But we should the full use of this should always include an arrow here for both products that were not fully consumed, like the land, right? It comes out on the other side. The machine is not fully consumed when it's used in one production cycle. It's what Marx calls fixed capital, because they pass on their value very slowly. But there's also the case of waste, which is a byproduct that cannot be reused. So we should add this as well. And again, if you take a more richer point of view with arrows that capture different information, you could, for example, show that there are relevant smaller boxes going on here that capture, for example, energy consumption, carbon emissions, things like this. But again, it makes no logical sense to add them just because this exists. Arrow here, carbon emission. That makes no sense, because the issue is what other arrows come in and out of this sort of thing. That's to logically include it. So you need a whole different perspective to objectively see carbon emissions, right? The only way to do them for now, for example, is to say that there is a carbon credit, and carbon actually has, the negative carbon credit equals some amount of money. And then you can, I can see it in capitalism, but that's because you first put it in the money fund, right? So, but with this crazy stuff, we can arrive at what I think is one of the last, I think we can even stop here, which is the factory structure, right? The factory structure, it adds one common place, one workspace. It has more than one machine, where the product of one machine goes into the other. It's coordinating labors, right? Sorry, it's coordinating the machines. Here's the MP. And labors are also having to tune themselves to this. So it pretty much brings together manufacture, machine systems, cooperation of variable capital, all into one big kind of infinite sort of structure we could look into, right? The only other thing we added that I think it's actually very nice is that we ended this with a definition of, well, two things that I think are very important. This thing here. Sorry, I think this is the point we shouldn't avoid it because it's important. We define this thing here on 14.3.6, which is the idea of a collective worker, which is the sum of the labor use employed, right? But the sum of the labor use employed is not limited by the sum of the labor values employed, right? As we said, like you can buy like three labor powers by 10 each, right? But when you combine them in the production process, the very fact, for example, that the resolution box of them is suddenly synced, this can change the laborers and the way that they use their labor in a way that you get for free, what we call surplus coordination. And while labor surplus value based on the labor time, exploiting the labor time of each laborer, is something that is easy to spot in the product because the product is valued more, and the laborers are individually considered in capitalism. So the individual exploitation of them by making the necessary time of work smaller and the excedent time longer, that is kind of coherent, or at least it can be seen, let's say, in capitalism in a way. But this sort of surplus extracted from coordination, it doesn't even have an input, right? This sort of, if you have like LP1, LP2, LP3 into the labor process, and the product is valued more than the labors you employ, you could retroactively ask how much did each labor pass on to the product. But the fact that when you compose the three together, right, there might be a generative aspect of their social coordination that leads to this. So this sort of collective surplus that's generated by the interaction it doesn't appear when you look back at laborers and divide by them the average that they contributed, right? So that's why we say that we make this addendum that the status of this collective within the capitalist world as a whole, that is under the expanded transcendental analysis of the whole thing, when you look at it, changes to the coordination of labor power in production directly affect productivity. This is our this is just a measure we presented in the previous chapter. But these changes have no corresponding increase in variable capital because the collective worker does not exist. There is no arrow coming into the collective worker, and the arrows that come out can be assigned to the individual laborers, so to speak, right? So we could say that only from the commodity standpoint, this collective use of labor exists as a bundle of labor powers. So when you want to talk about this collective cooperative entity, right, you can only talk about the set of labors that I employ. It is precisely that difference, for example, that trade unions and other forms of class struggle and things like this try to turn around. And this is also showing why the trade union has an ambiguous status. Because, for example, you can take, we call the sum of labors NPN, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And we call this use of labor, total use of labor use, LPW. What we could call a trade union is a way of trying to index this surplus coordination on the states and saying that, well, commodities don't see that there is something like a surplus added by laborers in terms of their coordination, but we, as the trade union of that particular factory, we will force the wages to correspond, right? So there is a lot of interesting stuff we can do exploring this. That again, I think uses the operette in a nice way. And the last thing I think we should mention is just that this idea of delta boxes allow us to distinguish technique from technology. And I think that was a nice distinction, that the difference between technical and technological changes to production can be defined by comparing two possible relations between the delta resolutions of LP and MP machine. So a technical transformation is one that transfers to a machine system a form of use that could otherwise be performed by labor. So if the machine does automatically something that I could do, that's a technical transformation. And we call a technological transformation one where the resolution of the machine could never be directly performed by labor. So if we call, I don't know, cold fusion or something more believable, I don't know, some nuclear fission, a technological advance, because the resolution box, the use refinement of the machine could never be performed by labor. Labor could never engage with the scale of the subatoms that would allow that process to happen. So when a resolution appears in a machine that could not appear in labor, we call it technological change. And when the resolution of the machine could be done by labor itself, we call it a technical change. So I think that's a nice scalar definition, right? Resolution-based definition of the difference between technology and techniques, right?
You would say that a self-driving car is a technical transformation. It's not a...
Yeah, it depends, because metaphorically, yes, but if you look at the actual process from the inside, right? I mean, it's true. Like, you can even imagine this case where somebody says, "I wasn't driving the car; it was self-driving," and somebody said, "Yeah, that's a technicality," right? I mean, the difference is not relevant. But on the other hand, coordinating infinite information of big data coming from the GPS of cars, synchronizing, calculating, and that's something that the person could not do. So in that sense, we could say there's a technological revolution to allow for a technical change.
Okay.
Right.
So
I
it's
mean,
not one, I mean, they can work together. You can have technological transformations that facilitate new technical work, basically.
yeah, exactly. I think like a microwave is doing something you could do with, I don't know, lighting a fire or whatever, right? But the technological change is not really happening as I use the microwave, which I could do otherwise, but it went into the making of the microwave, which made it capable of controlling certain forms of wave, right, to increase heat that I couldn't do on my own. I mean, I think it's even a matter of the boxes, right? If you look at the machine as these different processes, right? There is some input of energy in the microwave that is transmitted to the heating part that heats the food, right? And the heated food comes on the other side. Here's the energy, right? The electricity. It's true that the whole box, food, heated food, could perhaps, I mean, it's not really true because labor cannot heat food. It needs some technical apparatus that always kind of uses, right, the oven or the gas or even the fire already imply that you're using you're accessing the use resolution of a material that you cannot access by yourself, right? It needs to be mediated by the fire. It needs to be mediated by the microwave, so on. But if you were to take not the finished microwave, but just the thing that takes the energy and puts on the other side some wave controlling thing that can heat objects, right? This could not be substituted by labor with whatever, right?
Yeah, because I was thinking about oftentimes some technology is created way before its use and popularization within industrial processes or within like businesses or whatever. So would we say that the invention itself is the technological transformation, but the technical transformations come from the ways in which it reorganizes production?
Yeah, I think that now that you say it, I think that this can actually make sense of one of Badiou's statements that the accelerationists like a lot, when he said once that it's not true that capitalism has crazy technological advancements, because the advancements could be much bigger. And I think his point is that because technology ultimately needs to be employed in production process to produce commodities, there is a restriction on technology by some technical mediation, right? So there would be a technical constraint on technological development, we could say.
Yeah, I like that because it's very similar to the concrete and abstract labor view, where you have like almost like concrete technology and abstract technical organizations based on that technology.
Yeah, with the difference that the technical, I mean, there are technological processes that do output commodities directly, like very automated factories that, I don't know, use crazy 3D printers to kind of almost, you know, bring out of nothing, out of the material, straight the structure of a mannequin, for example, right?
Yeah.
The product is coming through a process that manipulates like on a almost like molecular level the material. We could never manipulate that material in that way with labor. So that happens. But for example, automated factory that still employs labor needs to constrain the use of technology, not only to the product, but also to the fact that it wants to use variable capital, right? It wants to use labor because that's how you extract surplus, right? So I think that's the ultimate argument of why capitalism will never fully explore the technologies that it that it can produce. It's even though capital is a paradoxical enterprise that needs labor, but at the same time expels more labor than it needs, right? It requires labor because only labor produces surplus value. On the other hand, it relatively needs less labor per means of production with time. But even though it expels a lot of labor, it needs labor. There is no reason for capital to fully automate itself. There's no reason for that, because then products would be sold by, I don't know, the price that you put into it. There would be no reason to sell them for a higher price on a global level. So you could say that there is a technical constraint on technology. We could argue that with this approach, right?
Yeah, that seems almost like a stepping stone, another way to talk about the organic composition later on.
Yeah, I mean, we did introduce it. I mean, I just skipped through it because we did introduce this notion, right? But
right, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean,
that was early.
But yeah, I totally agree. It has everything to do with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love this idea that I mean, it's only the three of us now, and we all read The Logics of Worlds. Remember that Badiou defines the point, right, as this thing that takes some degree, right, to yes or no, in such a way that this composes a structure that is, while P is from one transcendental, this structure here is a different transcendental, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we ended up doing is created the idea of a weak point. Like, no wonder that we use this element, this notation, for what a capitalist valorization is doing. Because this notion, of course, this is not a different transcendental, it's a different value in the same transcendental, right? With, let's say, it would be something like this. With M2 is higher than M1. And to make this happen, capitalism looks into its own atoms, looks into commodities, splits them into smaller commodities, mixes them together in crazy ways to make it a product that obtains this new value, right? Such that let's say the topology of this new space is coherent with the new value. So this is like a weakening of the theory of points, which means that it is a theory of capitalist novelty. But capitalist novelty is just a constrained type of novelty compared with other types of novelty. So, for example, if amongst all the uses of C, right, that this guy used here to make the product, well, there are other uses here that are in the subscript, right, coming in and out, that are not, you cannot see them from the perspective of capital, because capital is only interested in the uses that will make this weak point obtain, will satisfy this weak point. But for example, you might be interested in some other use that will take to some product P that might be less value than M2. For example, the standpoint of capitalism, you would say, but this is a weaker product. You know, it's smaller than M2. Why would I want it? Or it's smaller than M1. Like, you destroyed the material. But from the perspective of different logic, you would say, no, this is the best way to go. I think what we'll be doing in the next paper on organization is precisely exploring how this space might appear once you have different logics for different errors, where the rationale of increasing value might be offset. Somebody says it's meaningless to do what you just did. But from the perspective of something else, that's a point, right? That consists with other endeavors, right? So ultimately, this theory includes the theory of weak points into Badiou by chance. Like, we never thought about it properly, but it just fits. Like, it fills a gap that was missing in the book. Because, of course, saying the capitalist world doesn't produce anything new, nobody believes that, right? That only radical political change is a difference. People say, yeah, I don't buy it. But with this, we can say, look, there is a restricted theory of a novelty that doesn't exceed the transcendental. It just takes lower values to higher values, but it it takes lower values to higher values and nil values to higher values, but it never turns that new value into the atom that localizes the rest, right? So there is a restriction. It always needs to output a commodity. It can never subvert the commodity form itself, right? So there is a constraint on what this novelty is allowed to be, otherwise it's invisible for that system.
There might be also a theory of capitalist appropriation there somewhere. Like some procedure that intends to be a strong point, but gets appropriated as a commodity in the form of a weak point, something like that.
Yeah, for example, if we go to that, to this part here.
Which is something the left is always complaining about as well, yeah.
Yeah, this formalism accounts for that. Something which does not exist, right, will be the state and the community form can mediate its inclusion into the commodity world to be alienatable, right? So.
Oh yeah.
So, for example, artworks could easily be considered fictive commodities in this way. They're not being sold by the price of their making. They're being sold for a different price. That is very much like land. You know, like you're appropriating it, turning it into private property, and usually people use it as means of rent, right?
Yeah.
So it fits a lot. Yeah, but anyway, I think that this is you can really see the process, the project kind of gaining shape when we get to like how the productive sphere work, and it's crazy.
Yeah, I have some ideas about the point thing as well, but I'm not sure how it fits the weak point idea. But yeah, we can talk about it later. It's a big topic.
Yeah, I think that the issue that we will have...
It kind of lurked. This is a topic that kind of lurked while we were reading already the book, right? We were kind of asking about what about mapping not into another transcendental. There must be something there. I remember we mentioning this kind of thing. Yeah.
I think that I think right now we are between there are two things that can be developed here, right? Because
sorry about that, because I'm kind of brainstorming. Also, this has something to do with the four forms of change, right? Maybe.
Yeah, it's using everything.
Yeah.
So
because actually, just one more thing is when we talk about the multi-layer transcendental, we are already introducing kind of a proto form of the point, because we're mapping from the total transcendental to a sub-transcendental, right?
Yeah.
So there's already like something there.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say.
What is striking, that was a question while we were reading the book. Like we didn't have a use at the time, but it was a question that emerged.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that we have now the means to make this distinction. So we have a theory of weak points, which is a theory of, for example, the K point that turns M1 to M2, but M1 and M2 belong to the capitalist transcendental. So they have different values, but they belong to the same transcendental. We have something that I think we could call interlayer point, which is, for example, there is something that doesn't exist in the capitalist world. For example, a community. It's not considered as a relevant difference, but let's say X already exists in TA, and X does not exist in TC, right? And there is some process through which you can make it be seen in TC. So, for example, housework, care work, and the difference in pay between men and women is something that the commodity doesn't see. It can use that difference in its favor. And you can force an equality there, but that equality already existed somewhere else. So you're actually taking something that had new value in the capitalist world and you're forcing it into, but you're actually taking something that was already existent. It just didn't exist in that layer, but it existed in the world, right? So I think it's a bit of what we call the layer conformance, right? which is like indexing things to a world that didn't include it in a way that it changes the world a bit, right? Or you can make, let's say, capitalism be constrained by what happens in a different layer. So new laws constrain capitalist speculation, things like this, right? But then there is, I think, let's say the strong point is a point that it's including something that is in no layer, right? So X doesn't belong to TCAB, and then you make it belong. So I think that's, let's say, political novelty in the communist sense, in the weak communist sense, because it's political in the sense that it will be something new in the world, in the multi-layered world. But then there is the even stronger sense. So I would call this a political truth, because it will cut across every commodity, state, and community. But we can now define political economic truth, because we can talk about a change that will turn TCAB into TDCAB. It's not a change only of something that erupts in a world, it's a change in the transcendental, in what dominates in that world.
Yeah.
So I think this is what we're ultimately looking for. A notion of truth that not only interrupts or starts another world, but starts another world in which previous dimensions of the world are indexed at a lower level. So you're not simply changing, right? You have this layer, and this layer, and you're adding something that kind of mixes them amorphously, like, oh my God, it's coming through the indigenous movement, it's going against the law, and it's breaking with capitalist circulation. So it's not fooling any of them, right? It's political truth, it's universal. But this is different from the situation where this thing here allows you to come up with a different structure where the other three layers are now below this new one. And you would have to write the dominant one on top and A, B, and C below. So we now have the means to formalize what this would mean, like what this would look like, right? And how is it different from a political truth? So after universalism, there is the problem of, let's say, how we call particularizing universal as a new transcendental, right?
Mm.
And it makes sense to call this a political economical truth because it implies establishing a domain, a new logic, rather than simply a new global logic, rather than a new local logic, right? This would be a local logic that is new, and this would be a global new logic, right? So I think that we have all this stuff here to look into now. They all follow from this idea.
Yeah, and the notion of body as well is important.
Yeah, I'm actually
to treat the points, right?
Yeah, I'm starting to think that I will have to. I'm not sure if you saw the last stuff I added. I added today. I'm not sure if it's coherent, but if you look here, I added this idea for expanded capitalist reproduction, right? Like you have K and it can generate M2 and then apply M2 to production. So increase the size of its production to produce M3, right? But all these points, they are actually the same. They're part of the same thing, right? They are the same body in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I added this idea that there is like the class of individual capital, and for this to be possible, Marx claims that actually this makes all sense. Like if I'm gonna reinvest more money in production than I invested before, other capitals must be able to produce more, right? I need these guys to produce this quantity, which is a new quantity, right? So this guy can only become more, accumulate more, if other capitals can produce the commodities it needs to become more, right? So this would link points to some body, right? The competition body of commodity of capitalist production. So
I see. Okay.
See my point, like
yeah, it's like these individual organs of the capitalist body.
Exactly. Yeah. So a capitalist enterprise would not be a body; it would be an organ, and the network of productive capital, that's the body.
Okay.
Right. So for this guy, it's not about competition; it's about valorization. It's about turning some commodities of value 10 into commodities of value 15, right? It's about increasing the degree of existence, right? But for these guys, it's a matter of supplying and producing in such a way that this process can have, like, once I invest 15 now in new commodities, that this process can happen. So you start having a dependent structure on the points, right? K phi only becomes K plus phi if someone else produced the necessary means for that to happen. So you have dependent structures between capitalists, right?
Yeah, that's important because the points form a space, so they have to have a partial order structure.
Yeah.
In order for us to formalize the body of all of them.
Yeah. So this is exactly. Yeah, I summarized the chapter on the law of accumulation here. I just did it today, and I think that we should try to go over it using the idea of body, because it's all about mixing dependence of, like, this guy is gonna become bigger, somebody needs to produce more means of subsistence, and these points start depending on each other, but they don't depend in a totally ordered way. They depend in this weird kind of paths, right?
Yeah.
So I think we should definitely try to come up with this sort of weak body theory as well.
Yeah, that's quite amazing.
It works. I think it works. Hopefully. Yeah. So at least in the worst case scenario, I think people who say Badiou has nothing to do with political economy, I think that part of it we can put to rest. If it's useful or not, I think people can debate, but that part, I think it's settled, hopefully. Yeah. Anyway, I think it's okay for us to stop here, and also to assume we can move on with the discussion for next meeting, right? Rather than go over it again.
Yeah, that was quite impressive, quite amazing. Thank you, guys. It's very helpful to some other projects.